If you live in Menifee, California, and there is a knock at your door tonight, do not answer it. More importantly, don't leave anyone in the house by themselves. Get your phone, call the police, and stay together. I'm writing this as I'm sitting in this police station questioning room as a warning, so that what happened to me last night will not happen to you tonight. I live on my own in suburbia, my own little neighborhood, the kind of place where kids will be playing out in the streets with parents doing yard work when you pull into your driveway. That's exactly how last night began. My girlfriend and I pulled in and I got out of the car. We waved to the kids and had a friendly chat with Mrs. Rope next door. This was the kind of life that I had always imagined. And at 20, I couldn't believe it had already happened for me. We went inside and started our evening. We made dinner. We love cooking together. There's a symmetry between us that just works. We ate, we watched some TV downstairs. Just a normal night. Once it was time, we went upstairs and she started doing her nightly routine that girls do in the bathroom. And I just laid there in bed, reading Pen Pal for the 20th time, with the fan going and the water running from the bathroom. I almost didn't hear it. I wish now that the fan was set to 3 instead of 2, because then everything would be different. But no. It was just faint enough for me to hear the sound over everything else. I reached over and I clicked the fan off. I waited for a moment listening. God damn it, I thought, and I put my book down on the nightstand and I got up. I grabbed my zip-up off the chair and threw it on. And as I walked out of the room, I could hear my girlfriend starting to say something, but I wanted to get rid of whoever was at the door first. I slumped down the stairs, a little pissy, thinking that it was just another solicitor trying to sell me glass cleaner and I was going to have a fit. I zipped up the jacket as I flicked the light on next to the front porch, and I looked through the peephole, but it was pitch black. I flicked the outside light on and still nothing. I figured that the light bulb had gone out again, as I have had problems with it before. Reluctantly, I twisted the deadbolt and I opened the door to nothing. No one was there. I poked my head out to look around. The yard and the driveway were empty. Looking back, I made so many horrible mistakes. I stepped out onto the welcome mat. I scoffed and I figured that it was just kids trying to play a prank. I turned and I walked back inside, and after relocking the door and heading back up the stairs, I started to have a feeling. Something just didn't feel right in my stomach, and I knew that only one thing was going to put it at ease. Food. I walked down the hallway into the kitchen and I flicked on the light. Opening up the fridge, I started to scan the shelves for something quick and easy to eat. I settled on one of those wafer, peanut butter, and chocolate bars that you can get at the dollar store. I keep them in the fridge so that way they don't melt in my hand when I'm eating them. I peeled back the plastic wrapper, and as I started to take my first bite, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. The window above the kitchen sink was open. I'd never opened the window for the entire time that I'd lived here. I thought back, trying to remember when it could have happened, and then I recalled her saying that she was feeling really hot when she was doing the dishes. She must have opened it up to try and cool off. I walked over and I slid it shut, and finally made my way back upstairs. I walked back into the bedroom and the water was still running. I went to the entrance to the bathroom. "Did you say something earlier?" I began to say, but stopped. The bathroom was empty. Water continued to pour out of the faucet, steam floating up and clinging to the mirror. I stopped the water and I turned around to scan the room. She wasn't there. "Amanda?" I called out. And no answer. I went to the walk-in closet and nothing. I started to leave the room, but again something catches my eye. I glanced at my nightstand, and on top of my book was a piece of paper. It was folded in half and set up, making it look like a little tent. I reached out and I picked it up, and the first thing I obviously saw was the blood. It was a bloody fingerprint on the corner of the paper, and my heart started to race. And finally, my brain let my eyes pan over to read what it said. And even now, I wish I wouldn't have. She is in the house. Find her. I read it in those 6 words over and over. I looked around the room again, hoping to see Amanda just hiding in the corner, snickering like she pulled off an amazing prank. But the room was empty. I walked around the room, looking behind chairs and inside the shower, as well as inside the closet. I looked at the bed, and I felt like a 6-year-old again as I slowly knelt down to look underneath. My hands had apparently been getting sweaty because they kept slipping slightly against the hardwood floor. And I bent down and I lifted the skirt of the bed. Nothing. Just a couple dust bunnies and an old pair of shoes that I kept meaning to throw out. I stood back up and I started to become agitated. My mind didn't know whether this was a joke or if I needed to be terrified. "Amanda?" he yelled. "This isn't funny anymore. Now just come out." Silence. "Look, I am really freaking out. Just stop this." I walked out and into the upstairs hallway and quickly went through the rooms. The spare bedroom, empty. The exercise room, empty. Other upstairs bedroom, empty. I ran downstairs and I looked everywhere there too. It was just as if she had vanished. And all that was left was this note. I figured that the only thing left to do was to call the police. I ran back upstairs and into the bedroom. The bathroom faucet must have a leak because I entered and I started hearing faint drips of water. I went to the dresser to grab my phone, but it wasn't there. Neither were my keys or my wallet. I spun and I looked at my nightstand. They weren't there. I grabbed my jeans that I wore that day. I was in sweats by now, and I checked the pockets. Empty. I threw the jeans on the floor in anger. I stood there for a moment without a clue of what to do. I storm into the bathroom and I twist the knob. I hit the faucet, getting pissed, but then I froze. There was no water in the sink. And the drips, they sounded further away. I slowly backed out and into the bedroom. I moved around again, trying to determine where it was coming from. And as I moved closer to the bed, it got louder. And once again, I slowly dropped to my knees and I bent over next to the bed. My hand slowly reached for the bed skirt and I lifted it up. And for every drip, my heart pounded 50 times. I sank my hands down and looked under the bed. And then I saw it. A small pool or red about a foot in front of me, with more dripping down from above. I jumped to my feet and I pulled the sheets off the bed. I slid my hands in between the mattress and the box spring, and after a moment of hesitation, I flung the mattress up with everything that I had. And my throat closed instantly. I could not comprehend what was in front of me. My mind would only let me process the image one fraction at a time. At first, I saw my box spring sitting inside my box frame. And then I saw that there was a huge tear down the middle of the box spring. And then I saw Amanda inside the box spring, her beautiful face poking out from the tear. Then there was her neck, which was nothing but red. The final thing that my mind let me see appeared. It was right in the center, laying on her stomach. Another note. I couldn't move. Tears were streaming down my face uncontrollably, but I didn't make a sound. My hands began to violently shake and my knees collapsed on the edge of the bed spring. I reached down and I pulled Amanda's body up. My girl. My life. My everything. I wrapped my arms around her and I started to scream. The note slid off her, hitting the box spring. My hand slowly moved down towards the note, now barely even able to bend my fingers. I somehow managed to grasp the note and bring it up to my eyes. My vision was completely blurred from the tears. I wiped them against my jacket sleeve and looked at the note. Again, there was a bloody fingerprint, but at this point, it could have been mine. Everything is hazy from those moments. The words, The words are forever burned into my memory. They are the reason that I am sitting here now. The reason that I ran out of my house screaming for help. But where am I? I don't know when you're going to read this, but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc, it leapt at me. There was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands and arms and legs and torso seemed fine and I wasn't bleeding, but I knew that I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could tell that I was less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. The solution at that early age was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. And for a while, the subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say that my life began that week, actually, because that was when I met Mar. She and I got along great, though to be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched on to some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of my neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said that his name had always been Dan. I figured that I must have been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at the bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and I ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own key. "Hey," I asked her with confusion, "how'd you get a key?" And she just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. "I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating for 3 months. Living together. I'd literally just met her the week before. The thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap. Instead of causing a scene, I told her that everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation. But I did find something out of the ordinary. The date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me. And I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up. And for 3 years, I managed to live every day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. a social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing. The layout of nearby streets and the time that my favorite television show aired. Always those changes reminded me that the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years that I ever let myself zone out. And one day I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. And right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" And he laughed and he smiled brightly. "Silly, Daddy." My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old, and that he was in fact my son. The agony and heartbreak filled my chest, and it was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I could never see or know the first years of his life. Mar and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time that I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and I watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church, they had no idea what to do. Those priests, they didn't believe me, and they told me that I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. Doctors didn't have any clue either. Nothing showed up on all of their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. And by the time I ran out of options, I'd decided to tell Mar. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still have my job? Clearly I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser. But I still had a horrible feeling that something must be missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. But the night I set up a nicer dinner in preparation, she arrived, not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. And I answered, and I found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the setting on the table. "A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me." Thank the Lord, I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have to run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and I sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went on for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple of months. And when I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I shut up and I listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the furthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. And he said, "A writer." I told him that was a fine idea. Then I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. And when I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there. Eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said that she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted that she was the one. That was the first time that I truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly, since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reasons that she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at the best parts ahead. But of course, I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten much worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I'd wanted to believe. The closest that I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed the trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused and forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant that I would be able to speak with anyone else, never to be able to hold a conversation, and never express or receive love. And as the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds. And I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times that I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. And a teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa?" He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking, handed me a stack of papers, and he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you like to read it and tell me what you think?" "Ah, of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see." He burned bright red. "Trying to, anyway." "All right, run off and I'll read this right now." The words were blurry, and annoyed, I looked for glasses that I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room. Still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time that I would have there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple of kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway. And I saw my son, now adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story and I called out for my grandson, and he rushed down the stairs and into the living room. "How was it?" "Well, it's terrible," I told him truthfully. "But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behave like young people, but the structure of the story itself is very solid." And I paused. "I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story." He nodded. "It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal, not hopeful like they used to be." "You're far too young to be aware like that," I told him. An idea occurred to me. "If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures?" "Sure. I read everything I can. I love it." Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. And for the first time, I opened up to someone in my life about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. And for a teenager, he took it well. "You're serious?" "Yes." He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. "I'll look into it and see what I can find out. You should start writing down everything that you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound." Wow. Sounds like a plan. I was surprised. That made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. But how will I get all of the notes in one place? Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them, he said, frowning with thought. Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path like you're talking about through your life. See if there's a pattern. And for the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there. Sure. He turned and he left the living room, and I peered after him. I heard him banging around near the stairs, and finally he returned with a box, laid it out on the carpet, and opened it up to reveal a bursting stack of papers. And he exclaimed, "Holy crap!" But of course, being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. Did I write those? He looked up at me in wonder. Yeah, or you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this. He gazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. So you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird. That much I understood. Right. He gulped. There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time. His tone dropped to deadly serious. But I'll save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can. Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prison of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. Thank you. Thank you so much. And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and I began writing. And while the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs out of order. My first box was actually the 13th. My last box was the first. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew that it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and I stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snow fall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. Come on, I think I finally figured it out. I was so frail that moving was painful. Are you him? Are you my grandson? Yes. He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. How long have you been working on this? I asked him, aghast. Tell me you didn't miss your life like I've been missing mine. His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. It'll be worth it. He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. Look, this shock is carefully calibrated. The electric zap from his device was starting but not painful, and in the mirror I saw a rapid arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulder. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear. And its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on me. My now adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror, and after a moment he asked, Removing it is going to hurt very badly. Are you sure you're up for this? Fearful, I asked,
"Is Mar here?"
and his face softened. No, not for a few years now. I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true.
"How?"
We have this conversation a lot, he responded. Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better. Tears brimmed in my eyes.
"Then I don't care if it hurts or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive."
He made a sympathetic noise of understanding and then returned to his machines to hook several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It is a lesser spawn, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness or reality. When details like names and colors and objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you. I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head in the exact line with where the parasite's mouth had ringed me.
"What is this being?"
He paused his work and grew pale. I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me. And after a deep breath, he began moving again and placed his fingers near a few switches. Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but it's basically electroshock therapy. I could still see Mars smile. Even though she was dead, I'd just been with her moments ago.
"Do it."
The click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then I saw the mirror shaking and my body within the image convulsing. Oh, no. It did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. And as my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected, trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6 clawed, lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mar's smile was foremost, light brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. And the edges of that memory began lighting up. And I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of that had been fragmented by the fasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I jumped around in 12 times, but never actually lived it. And for the first time, I got to hold Mar's hand and be there for her. No! That moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in the hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. Oh God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down in tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I had seen all of the good parts, but I hadn't watched the worst part, the inevitable end that all one day would face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life, and I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward just like before, but this time it hissed and turned away. And I stood astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze. And while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, the phone rang, and I looked up in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in the hospital bed, dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. And at the end of it all, the only thing that I could have left, was sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. And on a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone. With a smile, I asked, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew.